So much. It's great to be here and great to see a lot of familiar faces and some new faces. I just had occasion yesterday or today, who remembers time anymore, to write an introduction to a new group I'm part of. And one of the prompts was surprising joys that have come during coronavirus quarantine. And what I mentioned was the joy of learning Torah with people from all over the country and world that would not be happening. I sorely miss a lot of the in-person teaching and organizing and socializing and meal sharing that I would usually be having. But what a joy to be able to share Torah with this illustrious group of people, which has never assembled before exactly like this and may never assemble again. This hour is it. This is our time. Maybe the whole world was created and Torah was given for this group to assemble and to see what we can unlock from it. So as Julie said, this is the second part of a two-part series. Many of you were here last week for our two-part series on immigrants and aliens, the place of the Gare in Torah. Last week we discussed the Hebrew word Gare and the many different translations that are offered in different translations and how we're more or less using alien. And we talked about what the term means in its own biblical context as a person who is living in the land of Israel, but isn't one of the 12 tribes. We talked about different stories for how such people might have gotten there. One possibility, which I think is probably not super likely from the pshat, the plain meaning of the Tanakh, though it is supported by rabbinic readings, is that maybe it refers to people of the 7 Canaanite nations who rejected the wicked ways of their despotic nations. And so it refers to indigenous people in the land who are acting righteously and morally. The rabbinic readings do support that. I think it's probably not so likely in terms of the plain context, but it does help justify the later parts of the Tanakh where the Jewish people consistently does not complete the genocides that God commands. And maybe we can see that as a heroic interpretation. The more likely interpretation, something else we talked about, is just that even though the Torah doesn't go into details, we are meant to understand, to locate Torah in life, the real world, in which geopolitics exist and economies rise and fall and personal economies rise and fall. And of course there's immigration for all the reasons that there's immigration otherwise. People who are in the trades and get involved in business opportunities in a new place. People who are persecuted in one land, maybe for personal reasons, maybe for large or scale political reasons, and migrate for those purposes. People who have wanderlust, people who had a tremendous loss or trauma where they were and go striking out in a new opportunity. So we talked about all those possibilities and how we're meant to understand Torah not as like a Disneyland fantasy book, but as a blueprint or a guide for real life. And what the Torah is very nervous about is saying we've created an economic system that's based on tribal organization. Like every other social organization and economy, tribalism has its advantages and it has its vulnerabilities, its weak parts. So the advantages are the ability to control equitable land distribution. And some of the real weaknesses of that system are people who are going to fall through the cracks. And that's more than anybody else, gerim, people who are living in the community but are not connected to a tribe, as well as to, on a smaller scale, widows, orphans, etc. So with that in mind, we looked last week not at the details, the many, many, many details that the Torah offers for specific laws about the equal treatment of gerim, but we did like a helicopter view of the 5 verses that most broadly speak about the Torah's commandment to treat gerim properly. We saw that as the Torah moves on, there's kind of an escalation, that right after the Ten Commandments in chapter 21 of Exodus, in the space of Revelation, we see the movement from really like a do no harm approach, do not oppress the alien, the Gare, because you were aliens in the land of Egypt. We saw that escalate by Vayikra, by Leviticus, to not only do you have to love your neighbor, who is understood contextually to be your fellow Israelite, but you even have to love the Gare, because you were gerim in the land of Egypt. And we saw that escalate to, in the most bombastic passage in the entire Torah, that speaks about God's godliness, God's greatness, in the most over-the-top, fabulous way, that God's great might and power and awesome and lordliness and godliness is about God's protection for gerim. And that translates into particular economic welfare. God loves the Gare, giving them food and cloak. Ve'ahavtem et hager, and you have to love the Gare. So we've gotten an understanding throughout this escalation that that not only doing no harm, but even active love are required in the Torah, that they derive from our own experience, and that they require practical, concrete, economic, political translation, and that is how we imitate God. Finally, we looked at toward understanding which aspect of our own experience the Torah is referring to when it says, remember that you were gerim in the land of Egypt. We did some thinking about, well, we had a lot of experiences in Egypt. When is the Torah referring to? We considered maybe it means slavery. Maybe it means actually the good times when Joseph's in a lot of power, but we're still, immigrants are always othered. Maybe it means the period of arrival in the land with that vulnerability. And we saw, based on the verse in Dvarim, prohibiting us from disdaining or abominating Edom, even though we have reason to, because they mistreated us, because they're our brother, and forbidding us from abominating Egypt, even though we have reason to, because they enslaved us and committed genocide, partial genocide against our babies, but we can't abominate them because we were gerim in their land. And following Rashi, we saw that it must mean then that being a ger in their land refers not to the bad times, but to the good times. And that we have this special obligation vis-a-vis Egypt, in some places to remember that we were slaves and what they did, but also to remember that we were gerim, to remember that a previous regime in Egypt did right by us, that we arrived as vulnerable famine refugees, seeking sustenance when we didn't have sustenance where we were. And we crossed a border with all the panic and terror and risk involved with that, fears of imprisonment, fears of murder, fears of exploitation and abuse. And it didn't happen. We were actually treated well. And what that means for us when we become landed and become in positions of power is never to lose track of the memory of that vulnerability and the gratitude for being taken in. And that's what animates us. We talked about how the slavery aspect might animate a do no harm posture. We know better. We know better than to abuse people. But it's really the vulnerability and the gratitude toward having been protected and taken in that animates our positive action, even though that same country became so hostile later on. So that's what we covered last week. So if you missed it, you didn't miss anything. Now you're all caught up. What we're going to look at today is two things. First, we're going to take a kind of aerial view at some of the details of how the rubber hits the road on doing no harm and showing love to gerim. And then we're going to spend most of our time, hopefully, looking at what happens when in rabbinic Judaism, the meaning of ger transitions from non-tribal resident, resident alien, to convert. and why that happens and what the implications are. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to paste a link to the source sheet in the chat. And it's open, so you all should be able to access it. I will also screen share, so you can access it whichever way you prefer. Okay. So immigrants, aliens, converts, the place of the Gare in Torah. Immigrants, converts, what's between them and implications. So the Torah, as I mentioned last week, more than any other topic, the Torah mentions in great quantity the importance of protecting the Gare. You can really hear the anxiety in the Torah that, like, this is the weak point of the economic system we've set up. And I think every economy has its own weak points. If the economy was set up in ways that more naturally protected gerim, there would probably leave somebody else exposed. The other thing is that immigrants are always vulnerable. Think of all the networks of protection that exist in bodies politic and in economies. Immigrants always have struggles to figure out their place. So I want to just skim these with you. We're not going to read all the verses. It is such a robust topic that would demand another couple of sessions to really go through each of the verses. So what I've done here is I've organized all of these commandments in the Torah that are about gerim, or directed to the protection of gerim, into several categories, and I've given you the citations. So you can look them up on your own. That can be a great learning project for Shabbat. So as we just take these in, let's see if we can draw any general conclusions. Is anything surprising? Are you surprised to see gerim included in any of these areas? And how might any of these translate to today's world? So 1, legal justice. Devarim chapter 24 specifically prohibits discrimination against gerim in legal judgment. You might think discrimination against anybody is prohibited in legal judgment, but there seems to be an awareness that gerim are especially vulnerable in the court system. Try to think about why that might be. Similarly, 3 chapters later, there's a special curse in the list of the curses at the end of Devarim in Parshat Ki Tavo against anyone who discriminates in legal judgment. 2, economic welfare. We already saw last week that God expresses love for gerim by providing food and cloak. Similarly, 2 passages command leaving harvest gleanings in the field explicitly for gerim, among others. Vayikra chapter 23 commands us to leave the corner of the field unharvested, mentioning the Gare as one of the classes of people who might need economic welfare. 2 passages in Devarim talk about the welfare tax every 3 years, known in rabbinic language as Maser Ani, and 2 passages prohibit having the Gare do work for you on Shabbat. We might think of Shabbat as a day of leisure, and therefore it would be much like the American weekend, where bourgeois people express leisure by going to leisure activities in which poorer people serve them. Go out for brunch, go to the mall, where poorer people are mopping and serving and deep frying, go to the movies where there's somebody who's poorer than you collecting tickets. So the laws of Shabbat expressly prohibit that and tell us that leisure means something very different for Shabbat. You can't have a Gare do the work for you. No immigrants doing the work. Economic justice. Devarim prohibits exploitation and requires paying promptly for day labor. I mean, think about in our country, numbers of immigrants and documented people doing day labor who are often their passports confiscated, etc. Similarly, there's legal accountability for the Gare. Torah explicitly obligates the Gare in core Israelite laws, including avoiding pagan practices, avoiding blasphemy, murder, and being accountable for tort damages. Gerim are accountable, just like citizens. Gerim have full criminal liability in the court system. Lest you think that what we said above about legal protection was being a special class. No, they are equal classes, which means that they can't be discriminated against, and they're not discriminated in favor of either. Fully liable, as part of the criminal justice system. And protection in cities of refuge for involuntary manslaughter. And holiday and observance worship. Gerim are prohibited from eating chametz on Pesach. They are obligated in the Pesach sacrifice and required to be circumcised if they have foreskins. They are included in all the sacrificial cults and the requirements to make certain sacrifices. They are included in the rejoicing on Shavuot and Sukkot at the temple. Culpability for offering sacrifices outside the temple. Can't have other pagan offerings. Once worship is centralized, any gerim who are in the land are part of it. And they're culpable if they go outside of it. Culpability for eating blood, requirement to cover blood in earth. These are national prohibitions. We can't have any exclusions based on that. Purification requirements for eating impure meat, all sorts of other regulations for sacrifices. Inclusion in the purification for death impurity. When the red heifer ritual is performed, that is effective for gerim as well. And finally, the inauguration and renewal of national life. In 3 passages, we see that when the Torah is read every 7 years, the Hakel ritual, gerim are explicitly included in that. So I'm going to pause the screen share and open for a couple of minutes of conversation. What do you make of that overview? Is there anything that surprised you or anything that didn't surprise you? Things that you were surprised to see, or maybe not. You can either show the raise hand feature or raise your hand physically, or just unmute yourself and start talking. Michael, I see your hand. Michael Mantel.
I have a question.
Sure.
Cleanings.
Yeah.
Are they competing with the poor?
It seems like gerim are understood to be part of the likely poor because they're not landowning. So those laws are mentioned for poor and for orphans, for widows, I believe, and for gerim. Who are all the people who, because they don't have their own inherited land, are likely to be food insecure? So what it means is that a corner of every field is dedicated to those who are not landholding, and gerim are at the heart of that.
I'm wondering if the prohibition or the requirement that the Gare follow the rules about blood and sacrifices is so that the community area remains pure under God's laws.
Great. You want to say a little more about that? What's at stake?
Well, if one person is doing something, doesn't bury the blood, let's say, then is the whole area becomes defiled.
Yeah, I think there might be a real issue. I think that there might be a real fault line here about what level of diversity a population can uphold, which is actually a real a fault line in immigration debates often. What kinds of cultural diversity, cultural practice diversity are allowed? And the Torah here seems to be very urgently saying that there can be no discrimination against immigrants at all, no tribal superiority, equal treatment. Along with that, if we're trying to create a model of equal practice, there are certain things that can't be allowed. Now, it doesn't mean nothing else is allowed. It's just pagan worship and blood consumption and a few other things. It may be that, other monotheistic cultural practices would be totally fine. But yeah, there is a sense that there's a limit to what an integrated community can tolerate. And that might be challenging to some progressive models today. Did anybody else have a hand or want to start to speak before? Going through the screens. Oh, Lisa sent a comment. When you consider everything they were to be included in, it makes them somewhat less a stranger. Yeah, and when, as we saw last week, when God says, I love the Gare, and you were all gerim, it really has the effect of limiting and narrowing the likely wide experience. And think about, as an American citizen, what level of interaction do I ever actually have with undocumented people in the United States? Or when I was living in Israel and I was an Israeli citizen, what kind of interaction did I have with Thai or Filipino foreign workers? I mean, the degrees of segregation are really extreme. Or Eritrean asylum seekers. And we see the kinds of abuse that can really happen. You see, in the UK and France and all throughout Europe and really globally where we have a refugee crisis right now. Let's see. Deb Schubach writes, I was not surprised because God created everybody equally. And even this week's Parsha in the US is also about keeping everybody in the same plane. Hannah writes, no, take it from a convert. You always feel like an outsider because everyone points out that you're a convert. We're going to get to that momentarily. Thanks for bringing that up. We're going to get to that pivot momentarily. Yes, Doris.
I don't know if I'm phrasing it properly or I missed something, but if the gerim were supposed to take part in sacrificial whatever, that had to do with their wages, and yet they were considered amongst the poor. How did they manage to? You had to have something to deal. Okay, money. I don't know what other word to use.
Sure.
So it's a sort of
very interesting. Yeah.
How did they do this?
Right. It's a very, very interesting question. Very interesting question. I haven't totally thought it through. What I can say kind of on one foot right now is that the laws about inclusion in the sacrificial cult generally don't require any individual to make an offering at any time. Most individuals never have to make sacrificial offerings, except you're theoretically required to go to Jerusalem for the pilgrimage festival. But we also know that a lot didn't go a lot of the time. But outside of the Korban Pesach, the Pesach sacrifice, an individual never has to make a sacrifice. But if you want to make a sacrifice because something glorious or wonderful happened in your life, you are included and you have the opportunity, and you have to become ritually pure and you have to follow procedures to do it. You can only do it in the prescribed ways. And so those laws apply to gerim equally. They can't be turned away from the temple. If they manage to scrounge together money, or maybe they're not poor. Maybe they've been able to, despite not owning land, they've entered a merchant class and have been able to make a middle class living, not through land subsistence, but through the merchant class. When they came in first, maybe they were relying on the corners of fields. Meanwhile, they started a trade and they started selling something, all sorts of labor things. You could set up shop in the land of Israel as a silversmith, rent land, have a shop, get paid wages, and buy your food, like most of us in an urban economy do anyway. So, and if that's the case, and you buy an animal to bring as a sacrifice when you want to. The one exception is that if you commit a dastardly sin, a sin that would have the death penalty if it were done intentionally, but if you do it unintentionally, you are required to bring an expensive korban chatat, a sin offering, a purification offering. So in that context, somebody would be required. And yeah, that'll be costly. And I think a good way to translate your question is, think of all the fees involved in American bureaucratic life. You fill out a marriage certificate or registering for classes at public college or even public elementary or high school for your children and signing up for various programs. A lot of the costs involved in getting through the loops even to receive government benefits. So I think there's some similarity. In general, it's worse to be poor than it is to be not poor. And immigrants are going to be disproportionately included in that poor class, but we see a lot of legislation to minimize that in ways that I think I would suffice to say we don't see so robustly in our country. So thank you for bringing that up. Is there anything on this list that surprised anybody that you would not have expected to see gerim explicitly included in? I can't see everybody, so feel free to unmute yourself and chirp up and have something. Julie writes circumcision, and Ashlyn writes chametz. Great. And I think, those are really paired mitzvot. In the rabbinic idiom, those, forgetting about gerim for a second, but for Israelites, for Jews, those are the only two, well, not exactly chametz, eating the Pesach sacrifice and circumcision are the only two positive affirmative mitzvot that lack of doing them has the punishment of karet, of excision from the people. The other 34 things on that list are prohibitions, mostly incest. And these are things that are really kind of nationally constitutive, that, declining to do a nationally constitutive act means you're not part of the story. So I'm fudging a little bit because that's about eating the Pesach sacrifice, not about the prohibition of chametz. But I think part of what Julie and Ashlyn are getting at is a surprise. Like, it's one thing to say that immigrants can't be discriminated against in any way and have to be provided for economic welfare and the justice system. But these seem like religious acts. And why would somebody necessarily be included in that way? Thank you, Deb. Nationally constitutive for males about circumcision. Exactly. And there's a whole complicated, big debate in the Talmud about women and nationality being automatically considered circumcised, not being defective, like the male body is defective, women being born non-defective or not. But yeah, the androcentrism of the Torah among all ancient and most contemporary literatures continues to be soul-crushing and problematic in all ways. Yeah, I think there are two potential responses to this. One response is to say, gerim, when we say there's inclusion, and you're part of it, it means that in a full-fledged way, gerim become part of the Israelite community as long as they're living here. And in other words, the 12 tribes are not the whole of the Israelite people. They're just the majority or the seed of the Israelite people in the land. Once you have landedness and control and power, then you are not limited by your tribal history. The people is going to expand in all sorts of unprotected ways, and everybody's part of the same story. I think another way, which is a pivot to where we're going now, is to say the Torah, when it talks about gerim, is talking about two different types of gerim, and is already here hinting at sometimes it just means immigrants, and that's maybe the do no evil mitzvot, are referring to immigrants, whereas these national constitutive acts apply to people who convert, who more formally, spiritually, religiously enter the Jewish people. Now that's anachronistic in the Tanakh. Certainly there's no such thing as conversion in the Tanakh, and tribal identity is passed on patrilineally and so on. But now that will help us transition. So I'm going to screen share again as we look at the next. So now, in rabbinic texts, the meaning of Gare shifts from a political resident alien to a religious convert to Judaism. There's a lot to be said that is beyond my scholarship or our time scope to go into how that happened, why that happened. I want to consider what's lost and what's gained in that shift. And in terms of how it happens, I want to just really consider 2 points. One is that the Talmudic rabbis of both Babylonia and the land of Israel interacted heavily with non-Jews, but not from a position of power, control, or even majority. counterintuitively, Babylonian rabbis interacted with more of a position of equality and power, but for the majority of really the entirety of the Talmudic period, Mishnah and the Amoraic period, the Jewish society in the land of Israel is under Roman occupation and does not have power. There are periods of more or less local control, local autonomy that the Romans gave them, but throughout this period, both before 333, when Constantine makes Christianity the official religion of the whole Roman Empire, including Palestine, and after that, Jews were never in control in the land of Israel. Babylonia, the Jews had more power, they were more autonomous, but still definitely and quite obviously a minority group in a political environment that was friendlier than Roman Palestine, generally, Zoroastrian Babylonia, but still they're a minority. So what that means is that there isn't a natural translation from biblical language around interaction with non-Jews or non-Israelites to the reality of post-biblical life, of rabbinic life. The context is just completely different. And that's a critically important piece to mention. There's no meaning to, I mean, all of the mitzvot that we just read about gerim in the Torah assume Israelite power and control and lay on the heavy warning against abuse of that power and control. So what meaning do we derive from Torah when we don't have that power and control in the first place? That's the critical question that faced the rabbis for how to do a vast rereading of all these mitzvot. So with tribal structure gone in exile, for a process and reasons that are beyond our scope to understand, individual conversion to Judaism was innovated, a new class of vulnerable people without secure footing in the community. And that's the through line that Chana brought up, that on the one hand, through this transition, what we've lost is having language for imagining ourselves in national political power, having language that refers to immigrants anymore. But what you do see the rabbis doing is translating and saying the Torah is extremely anxious and over the top lecturing in both general and specific ways about the protection of and inclusion of whichever people in the Jewish community are on its periphery and are most vulnerable and least included. So we may not have tribes anymore, but we have, here, I'll end screen share so we can see each other for this conversation. We may not have formal tribes anymore, but we have all sorts of things that guide communal religious life. Patterns of inheritance through families and family memory and family heirlooms, cultural conversations around family heirlooms for ritual purposes, the tallis that I got from my grandfather, and the Kiddush cup that my grandma gave me at my baby naming, and the parochet art cover in the shul that's named after the great grandparents of somebody who's there today or somebody comes back to. There are all sorts of things about family structure, and some much more materially or personally affecting structures too, around marriage opportunities, around inclusion or exclusion in Jewish institutions, and there can be concentric circles of exclusion and vulnerability for different Jewish people on the boundaries. Certainly the last few weeks and the last few years have really amplified the voices of Jews of color in American Jewish life, especially Black Jews, brown Jews, Asian Jews, who tell stories about the ways in which, despite being Jewish 100%, some by birth and some by conversion, they've been made to feel like not members of the community. And that's also true of white-skinned Jews who converted into the community, or who have both Jewish and non-Jewish ancestry, and if some of the don't have some of the more conventionally recognized identifiers or signifiers of inclusion in the Jewish people by name or by phenotypes that anti-Semites and Jews have conspired together to lift up as being somehow more Jewish than others. So as conversion becomes invented, yes, thank you, Deb, Ethiopian and Ghana too. Certainly in Israel, we've had, the Ethiopian Jewish community who have been Jews, ancestors as long as they can trace, who are still treated as outsiders, even though not converting. So we're going to focus on conversion within our context here and see the through lines, but also what happens once Gare becomes the word for convert as opposed to the word for immigrant. Does Judaism, does Torah anymore have anything to say about immigration when we think about bringing Torah values to life, let's say in the United States, or for that matter, in Israel? So I'm going to screen share again, or Canada, or any of the other countries, the UK. So here's the most widely quoted Talmudic passage about gerim. Talmud Bava Metzia 59b. I want us to think about what's happening and what's at stake in this passage. So it's been taught. Rabbi Eliezer the Great said, why did the Torah give warnings in 36 places? Some say in 46 places. In other words, all over the place, as we've talked about the Gare. Why is that such a dominant theme in the Torah? According to him, because they're susceptible to turn in a bad direction. I'm going to come back to that in a second. What does that mean? What is the meaning of the verse? Do not wrong an alien and do not oppress them, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt, which we saw last week. It has been taught. Rabbi Natan said, don't talk smack to someone else about your own defect. Not a perfect translation, but the idiomatic English reflects the Hebrew, which is a rhyme that is, I think, intended to be sort of idiomatic. Mum shebecha al tomar lechavercha. I think it's meant to be a little bit slang. And thus the popular aphorism, if someone has been hanged in a person's family history, don't say to them, hang this fish up for me. Now, there's a lot of unpacking to do because there's a lot of culturally specific language here. I think the important thing for us is interpreting this passage from the back up, from the end toward the beginning. One, microaggressions are real and they're prohibited by rabbinic law. In other words, like what Rabbi Natan is saying is that the meaning of the verse, don't wrong an alien, is not limited to economic exploitation and oppression. That's of course the case. But also, don't verbally taunt somebody. Don't try to use language that will remind them of something vulnerable for them when you're doing it as a taunt. Now, of course, today it's complicated because you might say, well, actually, wait, I don't know, because I'm a convert to Judaism and I'm proud of it. I love talking about that. I don't find it's actually offensive to see the Talmud thinking it would be embarrassing to me for somebody to know that. I'm proud of it. Or you might not personally be a convert to Judaism, but might know lots of converts who love talking about it all the time. But I think what we're seeing from within this isn't necessarily that it is inherently insulting, but that people use other people's vulnerabilities to create vulnerabilities and in a taunting way. You're not allowed to do that. And I think we can hopefully, if we're all paying attention, probably most of us can think of examples where we ourselves have either perpetrated or been victims of or observed statements, whether on the axis of born Jews to converts or other axes of being in an accepted group and being on the outskirts of it, of saying something that reminds them of that. Like, wow, you did that Torah reading very fluently for a convert. Remember we talked about the previous, some of you were at a previous class I taught about the insult in giving the wrong compliment, etc. So trying to remind somebody of their place, even though their place, the Torah has told us, is an equal place, but the fact of using it as a taunt is a way of lowering them. And I think this susceptibility to turn in a bad direction, I think, has two faces to it. One is that grief and depression and alienation. And another is distress and hostility. What happens if somebody is rejected by the community that was supposed to, if anything, do extra to make them, to assure their equality and inclusion? That person might become hostile at some point. And that's the community's fault. And that's why the Torah reminds us all over the place, hits us over the head. And so we're thinking of that right now on the axis of inclusion with regard to people converting into Judaism. For closure, though, I want us to be able to hold on to both of these. What happens once Gare means convert? Does it also still mean immigrant, refugee, asylum seeker? Sometimes you hear in kind of Jewish political discussions when, like, you know, groups like Trua or Hayas or people like that will try to like bring up these Torah verses to show that America should have, or Israel or Canada or whoever should have more inclusive and just immigration policies, such as not having concentration camps for babies on the border. And some people will say, well, wait a second, it doesn't mean that anymore. In the rabbinic idiom, Gare means converts. It doesn't mean immigrants. We don't have an immigration policy anymore because that's not what it means in rabbinic Judaism. So I would just call to your attention a few things. One, Rashi, in his comments on that passage, says, on don't talk smack to someone else about your own defect, since you are gerim, it insults you to bring up the topic of gerut. Now, even if we take that Talmudic passage to apply to born Jews being prohibited from taunting or othering or diminishing Jews by choice, what does it mean for Rashi, meaning for the Torah, and for Rashi in his interpretation, to say the origin for that is because of drawing from our own experience of gerut? We weren't converts to Egyptian religion. We were famine refugees and immigrants there. So the sages are drawing a real through line between these experiences and saying there's a larger category here of being vulnerable and on the boundaries of a society. If I think I'm such hot stuff and I count so much that I can, in a micro or macro way, taunt or lessen somebody else for their otherness, I'm just insulting myself. Who do I think I am? I was a famine refugee in the land of Egypt, and there's a through line between those two things. Now, the Rambam does specifically say that the commandment of loving the Gare, in his code, he explains that that means somebody who has converted to Judaism, somebody who came and entered under the wings of the Shekhinah. And there are passages that make some distinctions, that the things that apply to immigration still are just the do no harm passages, but the ritual inclusion and the love refers to people who are fully in, converts. But I want to make sure we don't overread that. And I want to just bring two passages to close, one philosophical and one halachic from two great sages. One is Rabbi Yosef Albo, medieval Spanish philosopher, who says, with regard to the Gare, it is said, Ve'ahavtam et Gare, you shall love the Gare, and it is warned not to wrong them. And that refers not only the Ger Tzedek, the righteous Ger, which is a term for a convert, but even a resident Ger, the Ger Toshav, the immigrant, who does not practice idolatry. We're going to skip the next part for time purposes when he explains why it means that. When you just talk about people who are immigrants and involved in our body politic, who are not ritually Jewish, it still applies to them, even to that person. And in a halachic work by Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan of Radin, who is known more commonly as the author of the Chafetz Chaim, was his ethical treatise, and the Mishnah Brura, his magnum opus halachic work, in his Sefer HaMitzvot, his short Sefer HaMitzvot, one of his other halachic works, on the positive mitzvah, Ve'ahavtem et Gare, the commandment to love the Gare, he says the following: you shall love the Gare, and this is in addition to you shall love your neighbor as yourself. For the Gare is also considered a part of Israel. Okay, so from there it sounds like he's talking specifically about converts. You might say, well, yeah, I have to love like real Jews, but converts, I don't know. And he's like, no. That's why the Torah says, not just people who you have established networks of re'ut, of camaraderie through born Jewish tribal things, but converts too. Not only love your neighbor, love the Gare. The Holy Blessed One loves the alien, as it is written, and loves the alien, giving them bread and cloak. And it is said, for you know the life of the alien, etc., etc. Now, listen carefully to this addition from Sefer Mitzvot. The meaning of Gare here is one who comes from another land or another city to reside among us. All the more so to a Gare convert who converts. And this is the practice in every place and every time with males and females alike. In other words, against the grain of what we thought in the beginning of his passage, the alien is also considered a part of Israel. We might have thought that therefore these laws, all the Torah commandments, apply only to converts once that's the case. He already here in the beginning of the modern period, imagining nation states, draws a careful through line for us to understand that what the rabbis did in translating the laws of gerim to the new structure of converts to Judaism, they weren't replacing the laws about proper treatment of immigrants or undocumented people. They were translating and expanding those laws to the realm over which they had control. They were saying, we can't let our community off the hook from the responsibility of full inclusion of people who are vulnerable just because we don't have the control that the Torah imagined. The Torah imagined we would have political, national, economic, judicial control. We don't have that. But we do have control in ways the Torah didn't imagine. It might be smaller, but we have to expand that message to this area as well. And Jews who enter into the covenant of Abraham, the covenant of Sinai, through conversion, the Torah tells us 36 or 46 times, are fully Jewish and it can't be discriminated against and have to be fully loved and included in every way. And that doesn't come to replace, but comes to enhance and expand the Torah's commandment about treatment of immigrants. Throughout most of Jewish history, we might not have had much opportunity to exercise that. But one of the opportunities of living in democratic countries or countries that claim to be democratic or aspire to it, and that recognize Judaism as one of the valid cultures that operate, and that we're not just a separate minority, but we're part of the democratic process. It means shining our light, what it means to be Jewish and think civically as a Jew, and to shine the light of Torah into our body politic is to say that we believe that citizens and power structures have a sacred obligation, repeated dozens and dozens of times, not to oppress immigrants and to even show love and radical inclusion to immigrants. We don't have exclusive control. We don't have control to, even in Israel, to enact that via Torah language, but we do have a responsibility as citizens of the countries we live in to shine the light, our particular light of civic responsibility, as the Torah is a civic book, among other things, into what it means to live as a righteous and responsible society. And we better get used to practicing that within our own particular communities where we do have that control, and to make sure that all the different levels of inclusion and exclusion that are possible, that we keep our eyes out for them and see all the 36 or 46 ways the Torah is warning us, and do that translation to make sure that whoever has been kept on the margins is brought in to being fully accountable, fully protected, fully accounted for in all of our religious, cultural, communal, civic, and political and national communities.